People often think the past is dormant, but it merely waits for a moment of weakness to rise again, reminding us of lessons that are never old. History may not repeat itself, but human pride and thoughtlessness always find a way to return. This true story is a painful testament to that, a lesson paid for with tears and the fracturing of a seemingly peaceful family. It shows that sometimes the silence of an elder can be more fearsome than a tempest, and a single thoughtless act can shatter what was built over generations. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths need to be spread, even if they might shake your beliefs. Some stories, no matter how painful, must be told. The afternoon fell with a heavy air over the ranch in the Central Valley, and inside the kitchen, the smell of freshly baked cornbread, mixed with that of new fabric, spread across the table, a white fabric, waiting to become a bride's veil. Clara, with 79 years on her shoulders, bent her frail, curved body while her trembling hands tried to pass the needle through the fabric. Each stitch was a small victory against the tremor that age imposed on her, and a soft murmur escaped her lips, saying that haste unravels the heart. She said it more to herself than to anyone, as if she were also embroidering her memories and sorrows into the cloth. Her gaze was full of tenderness and weariness, remembering all the times she had sewn dresses for her daughter when she was a child, with the hope of one day seeing her happy. But now she felt that with each stitch, she was also sewing up the cracks in a weakened bond. Across from her, Scarlett, the 2-year-old daughter, had skin flushed with wedding anxiety and eyes tense with impatience. She couldn't stand the slowness of her mother's hands, nor the weight of the advice that fell like constant drops. And suddenly, with a sharp gesture, she snatched the needle away while shouting not to ruin her day, that she always did everything her way, that she never let her make her own decisions. The needle slipped from her fingers, and the broken thread fell to the floor, tangling on the terracotta tile like a bitter omen. Clara looked at her, wounded. Her eyes welled up more from sadness than from tired sight, and she tried to respond calmly, saying that she only wanted to help, that she was doing it with love. But Scarlett replied with a sharp voice, saying that all she managed to do was meddle, that this wedding was hers, and that no one, not even her mother, was going to spoil it. The atmosphere grew thick, and in the midst of that silence, the light, venomous laugh of Patricia, the mother-in-law, appeared. She observed the scene from a high-backed chair with a contemptuous smile. She said with a sharp voice that in her family, things had always been done impeccably, with elegance and without improvisation. And she looked at Clara as one looks at a worn-out object, as if the woman were nothing more than a nuisance at the celebration. Clara, with dignity in her voice, though with a heavy heart, replied that in her family, things had always been done with love, although she knew that word was seen as a weakness in the other woman's mouth. Scarlett pressed her lips together in annoyance, looked away, and began arranging the flowers on the table with jerky movements, as if that act could erase what had just happened. In the doorway, leaning on his wooden cane, stood Walter, the 6-year-old grandfather, a silent witness to the scene. His old eyes had seen wars, famines, and losses, and now they saw the same story of pride and arrogance repeat itself at a wedding that should have been a celebration. He said nothing at first, but he lifted his cane and let it fall gently against the floor, and that hollow sound echoed in the room like a contained thunderclap. That subtle tap weighed more than any shout, and everyone stood motionless. It's in these quiet moments that the deepest cracks in a family begin to show. A broken thread, a contemptuous smile, and a grandfather's silent warning, this is only the beginning of a storm that is about to break. Let's see what happens as the wedding draws closer. Scarlett pretended not to hear, but inside, something trembled like a crack. Clara lowered her gaze, picked up the fallen thread, and tried to thread the needle again, her fingers trembling, but with the determination of someone who refuses to give up. She wanted to prove that she was still useful, that she could still support her daughter, even if it was with a piece of fabric between her fingers. Patricia, with her lips painted bright red, leaned forward and said in a venomous tone that it was embarrassing that things were still being improvised at this stage, that her son Logan deserved a clean and perfect wedding, without stains or ridiculous scenes. The silence stretched out again, heavy and hostile, until Walter raised his voice slowly, saying that in families, what is truly inherited are not luxuries or decorations, but the way of respecting one's elders, and that whoever forgets that lesson builds nothing but ruins. His words were not advice, they were a sentence. And although no one dared to answer, they lingered in the room like glowing embers that burned without going out. Scarlett bit her lower lip. She wanted to respond, but shame stopped her, trapped between anger and the pain of being exposed in front of everyone. Clara closed the sewing box with a soft click, as if putting away not just a needle, but also a wounded heart. Outside, the sky was darkening, and the smell of rain filled the air, and everyone knew in silence that something had broken even before the wedding had begun. The night before the wedding arrived, wrapped in an air of nervousness that could be felt in every corner of the ranch. The sky was overcast, and the crickets' chirping was interrupted by gusts of wind that made the oak trees creak. Inside the room, lit only by a yellowish lamp, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, pensive, looking at the folded veil resting on a chair, which she had half finished after her daughter's outburst. She felt the weight of unspoken words pressing on her chest because she had been hearing comments from neighbors and acquaintances for hours, saying that Logan had unsettled business in Los Angeles, debts and entanglements that could cast a shadow over Scarlett's life. And although she knew that any warning could unleash her daughter's fury, her worry won out, and she got up and walked slowly to the room where the bride was trying on her dress in front of the mirror. Scarlett, with the dress half adjusted and her gaze full of pride, turned impatiently when she saw her mother enter and asked what she wanted now. And Clara, with a calm but trembling voice, told her that she had heard worrying rumors that some said Logan had pending matters in Los Angeles, unresolved business and shady affairs that could bring misfortune, and she begged her to think carefully before giving her life to a man who might not be what he seemed. Scarlett's reaction was immediate, as if those words were gasoline on a burning fire. She let out a cry, saying that she wouldn't sabotage her, that she had always distrusted everything and everyone, that she couldn't stand this habit of meddling anymore, and she accused her mother of envying her happiness because she had never had a wedding like this, nor a husband with money and position. As she raged, her hands struck the table, knocking the open sewing box. The small metal thimble skittered across the stone floor with a sharp, metallic clink. It spun to a stop between them, a silent and bitter omen on the cold ground. Clara lowered her gaze and murmured that all she wanted was to protect her, that a mother always senses what a daughter refuses to see. But Scarlett replied that she didn't need her protection or her warnings, that she was no longer a child, and that the only thing she demanded was to be left in peace, to be supported instead of having her dreams buried with rumors from the farmer's market. The atmosphere became unbearable. The lamp flickered as if the tension reached it, and in the doorway, in the gloom of the hallway, Walter stood with his elongated shadow, watching the scene in silence, his eyes sunk in deep wrinkles that seemed to read beyond the words, not intervening, but absorbing every gesture, every reproach, and every contained tear. His presence was like an invisible wall, a witness to the confrontation. And although he said nothing at that moment, the cane he held in his hand tapped lightly against the floor, not as a warning, but as a reminder that he was there, that the weight of tradition and memory accompanied him, and that what was happening that night would not be easily forgotten. Scarlett turned back to the mirror, trying to ignore her grandfather's figure and her mother's voice, and concentrated on adjusting her dress, repeating in a low voice that nothing and no one would ruin her day, that the future was already decided. Meanwhile, Clara picked up the thimble with trembling hands and put it back in the sewing box, like someone putting away a premonition, her heart heavy with the certainty that a mother's love is never enough when pride stands in the way. Outside, the storm seemed to be approaching with a dull rumble, and inside the house, there was a sense that the walls had witnessed a wound that would take a long time to heal. The church bells rang with an almost defiant force against the gray clouds gathering over the town, and although each peal seemed to announce joy, there was a strange premonition in the air, as if even the metal felt that the storm was about to break. The church was adorned with fresh flowers that gave off an intense aroma, roses and lilies intertwined in makeshift arches that the neighbors had helped set up since dawn, and the bright colors contrasted with the increasingly dark sky. The guests arrived, dressed in their best clothes, some in rented suits, others in dresses passed down from other celebrations, and everyone held small smartphones that shone under the reflections of the yellow lights, ready to record every moment of the union between Scarlett and Logan. Inside the church, the murmur of the service mixed with the rustle of fans and the creaking of the wooden pews, and every so often, Clara's restrained cough could be heard. She remained seated in the front row, her face serious and her eyes fixed on her daughter. She thought about all she had been through to get to this moment, the arguments, the silences, the unheeded warnings, and she felt her heart beat with a rhythm of hope and fear at the same time, because she knew that the clouds gathering outside were not just in the sky. Scarlett, on the other hand, walked tall down the center aisle with her gaze fixed forward, holding her father's arm in a dress that made her shine, and a proud expression that left no room for doubt. She smiled for the phones, tilting her head slightly so everyone could see her, and seemed not to notice her mother's gaze, which followed her with a mixture of wounded pride and unconditional love. When the priest pronounced the final words and the guests applauded, a clap of thunder shook the walls, and at that very instant, the rain began to fall with a boundless fury that turned the exit from the church into an unexpected spectacle. The dirt roads transformed into a river of mud that ran swiftly between the stones. Long skirts were soaked in seconds, and men ran, lifting their pants while holding on to their hats. Some guests tried to cover themselves with the service programs. Others laughed nervously, and the smartphones kept recording as if this downpour were part of the script of a dramatic movie. Scarlett squeezed Logan's hand and walked with hurried steps, careful not to let her dress drag too much in the mud. Meanwhile, Patricia, impeccable under a black umbrella, walked with a haughty gesture, as if the storm could not touch her. Clara, however, lagged a few steps behind, trying to follow her daughter through the commotion, her shawl soaked and stuck to her shoulders, and her shoes sinking into the mud. When she managed to get close to Scarlett amid the chaos, she saw that her daughter's veil had gotten tangled in the buckle of a guest's chair and was about to tear. So, with quick but trembling hands, she tried to fix it, saying, "Let me fix it before it tears." Scarlett turned abruptly, and with her eyes burning with fury, she screamed at her to leave her alone, that she didn't need her help, and in a fit of rage, she pushed her mother with both hands in front of everyone. Clara lost her balance and fell backward, her back hitting the soft, wet ground. Her white blouse was instantly stained with mud, and the veil she was still holding in her hand was muddied along with her. A murmur spread like an echo among the guests. First, an icy silence, then nervous whispers, some uncomfortable laughter, and even the metallic sound of a phone that continued to record without mercy. Logan stood paralyzed, his mouth half open, not knowing what to do, and Patricia pretended not to see, lifting her chin as if it were of no importance. From the ground, Clara looked up at her daughter and said nothing. She just blinked as the rain fell on her face, mixing with the tears she didn't want to show. In that instant, Walter moved forward with slow steps, leaning on his cane, which sank into the mud with each movement. He bent down to offer Clara a clean handkerchief, helping her up with her dignity intact. When he looked at Scarlett, his voice was low, yet it cut through the murmurs with absolute authority. "What I have seen," he said, each word landing with the weight of a stone, "is not a bride, but a child who still does not know the meaning of respect." The silence became heavier than the rain. Some acts can't be taken back, and the shame of a public humiliation leaves a scar on an entire family. Walter's words were not just a scolding, they were a judgment, and you can be sure that a man like him will not let this go. The party may continue, but the real story of this night is just beginning. The guests lowered their eyes, and although the music started playing again in some corner of the hall, everyone knew the party would no longer be the same, because what had fallen in the mud that afternoon was not just a mother, but the heart of an entire family. The silence that followed the push was absolute. The rain, the whispers, the nervous laughter, it all vanished, replaced by a single, horrifying image. Clara, covered in mud, looking up at her own daughter. Logan was frozen, his mouth agape. Patricia feigned a sudden interest in the storm clouds above, her face a mask of indifference. The guests looked away, their secondhand shame a palpable force. It was a wound that had opened in public, bleeding in front of everyone. Then, a sound cut through the stillness. Thud. It was the sound of Walter's cane striking the mud. Every head turned. He advanced slowly, his ancient frame moving with a deliberate purpose that commanded more attention than any shout. He reached Clara, bending with the awkward grace of his age to offer her a clean handkerchief and help her to her feet. Only when his daughter was standing, her dignity restored as much as it could be, did he fix his gray eyes on Scarlet. In a grave voice that seemed to carry the weight of generations, he said, "What I have seen is not a bride, but a child who still does not know the meaning of respect." And his words were not a heated reproach, but a sentence that fell upon everyone like a silent lightning bolt. The murmurs died down. No one dared to respond, and Scarlet's shame was reflected in the trembling of her lips, though her pride did not allow her to bow her head. The party continued out of obligation. The music started playing again, and some guests raised their glasses, trying to bring a celebratory air back to the night. But the echo of the push could not be erased. It was in every averted glance, in every restrained gesture, in the discomfort that made the dances shorter and the laughter seem forced, because what had happened could no longer be undone, and the memory of a mother covered in mud in front of everyone had been tattooed on the community's memory as a bitter lesson that was just beginning to unfold its consequences. The community hall was almost dark as midnight approached. The last guests had left in the rain, leaving behind a heavy air of whispers and comments that still floated among the tables. The burnt-out candles barely illuminated the tablecloth stained with wine and mud, and the echo of the music was now just a distant hum that got lost in the puddles of the courtyard. The silence was so dense that when the gate bell rang 3 times, sharp and firm, everyone still in the place shuddered, as if the bronze had struck their hearts. Walter, with his cane in hand, had rung the bell without raising his voice. And yet, that sound drew everyone to the center of the hall, where he stood waiting by a wooden table marked by the years. No one dared to ask why, because Walter's authority needed no explanation, and one by one they approached. Clara, still with her shawl, damp from the storm. Scarlet, with her makeup smudged and her eyes red. Logan, with the twisted expression of someone who wants to escape but doesn't know how. And Patricia, with her chin held high, feigning control amidst the discomfort. Even some trusted witnesses remained, drawn by the certainty that something important was about to happen. Among them was Mr. Martin, the family's longtime attorney, whom Walter had quietly summoned earlier that evening. Walter waited in silence until everyone had taken their place around the table. Then, with a slow, almost solemn movement, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a yellowish envelope, creased at the corners from the passage of time. An envelope that, when placed on the table, seemed to have a much greater weight than it actually did. The murmur that was beginning to grow among those present died down immediately when Walter said that this night could not end with shame dragging down his family, that the time had come to set things in order. He pointed to the envelope with a firm finger, adding that on that paper was written a decision made many years ago, a decision that had been waiting for the right moment to come to light. Logan nervously asked what the envelope contained, and Patricia replied that she didn't understand why they had to ruin the wedding even more with old papers, that it was best to forget what had happened and let everyone get on with their lives. But Walter didn't even look at her. He just lifted his chin and called for Mr. Martin, the attorney, who had been sitting discreetly in a corner since the afternoon, and asked him to come forward to open the document in front of everyone. Mr. Martin, a middle-aged man with a serious face and a deep voice, took the envelope respectfully, opened it carefully, and unfolded several sheets bearing a signature and seal from years ago. He began to read aloud as silence took over the hall. Scarlet shifted restlessly in her chair, her damp dress clinging to her body, and Clara bowed her head as if she sensed what was about to be heard. Mr. Martin read slowly that Walter Salgado, the rightful owner of the family home located in the heart of the ranch, had established an irrevocable condition at the time of granting said property as a dowry to his granddaughter, Scarlet. The condition was that the house would remain in the granddaughter's name only as long as she publicly honored her mother. And in the event that this honor was clearly broken, the property would immediately return to the lifelong use of Clara, and subsequently, after her passing, it would be allocated to a community scholarship fund for the youth of the town. The echo of those words fell like a slab in the empty hall. Scarlett opened her eyes in disbelief and exclaimed that it was unfair, that no one could take away what had already been promised to her, that her grandfather was manipulating things out of revenge. Logan tried to calm her down, whispering for her not to raise her voice anymore, but she pushed him away, saying she wouldn't stay silent. Patricia protested harshly, saying that these conditions were ridiculous and that her family would not allow such a humiliation. But Walter raised his cane and struck the floor firmly. The sound echoed off the bare walls, and everyone fell silent instantly. Then he said slowly that there was no trick or revenge, that what was happening tonight was a lesson, that respect cannot be bought with parties or dresses, and that one who humiliates their mother in public does not deserve a roof raised on the memory of their ancestors. Clara barely lifted her gaze, her eyes wet, her face marked by a mixture of pain and relief, because in her father's words, she felt acknowledged after being thrown into the mud in front of everyone. Mr. Martin closed the document and placed it on the table, confirming in a clear voice that the clause was legitimate and still in effect, and that from that moment on, the house was restored to Clara. This is about so much more than a house. It's a lesson written in ink and sealed by time. In a single moment, Scarlett has lost everything she thought was important. But when pride is shattered so completely, what rises from the ashes? Let's listen on to see if this is the end for her, or a painful new beginning. No one dared to argue further, although the air was thick with contained anger, shame, and helplessness. Because Walter's authority was indisputable, and his word weighed more than the storm raging outside. Scarlett put her hands to her face and sobbed silently, understanding that in a single act, she had lost not only her dignity before the town, but also the house she dreamed of as a symbol of her new life. And in that cry, wounded pride, mixed with the pain of knowing she was defeated by the force of a tradition she could not change. In the days that followed, the weight of that night settled upon Scarlett like a shroud. The silence in the house was no longer a weapon she wielded, but a crushing judgment. Logan's empty platitudes and Patricia's venomous whispers offered no comfort. She was adrift in the ruins of her own making, the echo of her grandfather's sentence and the image of her mother in the mud replaying endlessly in her mind. The loss of the house was a bitter pill, but the loss of her own self-respect was a poison that seeped deeper, leaving her hollowed out and ready to shatter. In the days that followed, the weight of that night settled upon Scarlett like a shroud. The silence in the house was no longer a weapon she wielded, but a crushing judgment. Logan's empty platitudes and Patricia's venomous whispers offered no comfort. She was adrift in the ruins of her own making, the echo of her grandfather's sentence and the image of her mother in the mud, replaying endlessly in her mind. The loss of the house was a bitter pill, but the loss of her own self-respect was a poison that seeped deeper, leaving her hollowed out and ready to shatter. Walter remained standing, upright despite his age, and finally said that everyone must learn that life is not sustained by pride, but by respect, and that this night would be remembered not as a punishment, but as a warning for everyone's future. He then fell silent, rested both hands on his cane, and closed his eyes for a moment, as if that decision weighed on his soul as well. But he knew it was the only way to save his daughter's dignity and to teach his granddaughter the price of her actions. Outside, the rain continued to fall relentlessly, beating against the tin roofs and washing the mud through the streets of the town, while inside the hall, the entire family understood that the real storm had just been unleashed upon them. As the attorney's final words fell, Scarlett felt the world tilt. The color drained from her face, leaving a pallor that matched her white dress. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold dread. Her breath caught. Her eyes darted around like a cornered animal, because she suddenly understood. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a threat. It was a sentence, written in ink, and sealed with her grandfather's will years ago, waiting patiently for this very moment. It was then that Walter's cane struck the floor again, the sound like a judge's gavel. "On this day," he said calmly, "you did not honor your mother. In my house, there is no room for ingratitude." The old man's voice was firm but not loud, and each syllable had the force of a stone placed in the exact spot to support a wall. and although he did not raise his tone, everyone knew there was no room for argument. Scarlett wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that it was a moment of anger, that her mother always smothered her with criticism, and that no one understood how difficult it was to live under that shadow. But the words got stuck in her throat because she found no strength, and because the gazes of the others accused her without needing to say a thing. Logan tried to intervene, stammering that maybe they could find a compromise, that weddings are tense moments, and that a person shouldn't be judged for a single outburst. But Walter interrupted him by raising a hand and said that a man who wants to be part of this family must first learn that respect for the elders is not negotiable, that one who does not know how to honor the blood that precedes them cannot build anything lasting. Patricia, who until then had maintained her haughty demeanor, exclaimed indignantly that this was a trap, that no one could base a family's fate on a paper signed decades ago, and that the Rockwells were not going to accept such a humiliation. But Mr. Martin held up the document and said that the clause was duly registered, that it was legal, and that there was nothing to contest its validity, and therefore, from that moment on, the house returned to the lifelong use of Clara. The attorney's words were like a stone slab falling on Scarlett's chest. She broke into choked sobs, saying her own grandfather was dispossessing her, that her mother had poisoned him against her, and that no one seemed to understand she just wanted to live her day without interference. Clara listened to everything in silence, her eyes full of tears, but not from joy or revenge, but from the sorrow of seeing her daughter lost in pride and arrogance. And yet, deep down, she felt a sad relief, a consolation that at least, for the first time, someone was restoring the dignity that had been ripped from her hours before in the mud. Walter rested both hands on his cane and said slowly that this was not about punishment or revenge, that what he was doing was reminding his granddaughter that life demands respect, and that one who humiliates their mother loses not just a house, but the right to call themselves an heir. The echo of that sentence hung in the hall like an invisible hammer blow, and as the storm continued to beat against the roofs and windows, the certainty settled on everyone present that this night would not be remembered for the toasts or the songs, but for the lesson of an old man who knew how to protect his daughter's honor and restore the sacred weight of memory. Patricia rose from her chair with a sharp movement that made the tablecloth tremble and the empty glasses clink against each other. Her face was flushed with fury, and her gloved hands moved through the air as if trying to push away the authority that filled the hall. With a voice that cut like a knife, she declared that this was all a trap, that no one in their right mind could believe a yellow document signed decades ago had the power to ruin a wedding and strip a daughter of what was rightfully hers. She said it was a show put on by Walter to humiliate his granddaughter and to make the Rockwells look ridiculous in front of the town. She added with contempt that she had never trusted the backward customs of a family that clung to old papers and dead words. Her protest rose above the silence like a lightning flash, but all it achieved was to make the witnesses' gazes turn colder, because in the eyes of the community, what was being defended was not a house, but respect for a mother struck down in her pride and thrown into the mud. Logan, his face pale and his hands damp with sweat, tried to intervene. His voice was trembling and almost pleading as he said that maybe they could reach an agreement, that the wedding shouldn't end this way, that a dignified solution could be found for everyone, perhaps postponing the transfer of the house or renegotiating the terms. The important thing was that the union between him and Scarlett not be tainted by a piece of paper. As he spoke these words, he glanced at his mother for support, though deep down he knew that Patricia would not move from her trench of pride. But Walter, who had remained upright with his 96 years weighing on his shoulders like centuries of history, slowly raised his cane and brought it down firmly on the floor. The blow echoed, sharp and decisive, as if waking the very walls of the hall. With a calmness that was more fearsome than any shout, he replied, saying that in this house, the elders are respected first. Whoever doesn't understand that basic rule cannot claim an inheritance or a roof, because heritage, without respect, is just dust carried away by the wind. He said he was not willing to negotiate because the lesson had to be clear and it had to be remembered. That respect for a mother is not a bargaining chip. His words, spoken in a deep, deliberate voice, seemed carved from ancient stone that no one could contradict. Scarlett, who had tried to maintain a mask of wounded pride, finally broke. Her face crumpled, and sobs racked her body, shaking the chair she sat in. She looked like a child caught in a tantrum of her own making. The entire room held its breath, waiting. This was her moment, a chance to utter a single word, sorry, to look at her mother and bridge the chasm she had created. But her throat closed up. The shame was there, a burning coal in her stomach, but her pride was a fortress around it. She could not, or would not, say the word. And her silence was the final, damning answer. Clara watched in silence, her eyes misty, her hands clasped in her lap, feeling that each of her daughter's tears was also her own. Because although she knew that justice was on her side, a mother never rejoices in her child's fall. And in the depths of her heart, the only thing she wished for was a word of reconciliation that did not come that night. The hall fell still. Outside, the storm beat furiously against the window panes, and everyone understood that this wedding would not be remembered for the dress or the music, but for the way pride crumbled before the community, with no one able to pick it up off the floor. 3 days after that wedding, which had ended in silence and shame, the ranch seemed to breathe a dense air of damp dust that still smelled of the storm. The withered flowers from the celebration remained piled in a corner like mute witnesses to a festivity that never truly happened, and the neighbors passed by on the street with curious glances, some murmuring that this was God's punishment, and others saying that all pride, sooner or later, meets its downfall. Clara walked slowly through the courtyard, her bony hands gathering the remnants of the party. Each step reminded her of the image of herself covered in mud on the ground, though she forced herself to keep a serene face so as not to give others the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Scarlett remained inside the house, sitting in front of the mirror with eyes swollen from crying and her wedding dress crumpled in a corner like shed skin. Her hands trembled every time she thought of her grandfather's words and her mother's look. But still, her pride kept her from crossing the doorway to ask for forgiveness. Logan had spent those days in a state of nervousness that barely let him sleep. He walked around the ranch like a man looking for a way out of a maze, avoiding his neighbors because he knew their gazes were full of judgment. Meanwhile, Patricia continued to talk of plots and conspiracies, convinced that the whole thing had been staged by Walter to destroy her son's union with the Rockwell family. On the third day, as the sun was just beginning to warm the damp earth, a young woman appeared at the gate, holding a little boy's hand. Her figure contrasted with the dusty road. She wore a simple but clean dress and had the firm eyes of someone who has come to speak a burning truth. The boy, barely 5 years old, held a worn wooden top and looked with curiosity at the puddles still left in the courtyard. It was Jessica, a 8-year-old woman who walked firmly through the entryway and asked to speak with Logan. And when she had him in front of her, surrounded by the astonished gazes of Scarlett, Clara, and Walter himself, she did not hesitate to say what she had kept silent for too long. She said with a clear voice that she didn't come to destroy anything, that she wasn't looking for a fight or a scandal, that the only thing she wanted was for him to acknowledge what he had left behind. And as she said it, she squeezed the hand of the boy who looked at her without fully understanding the tension of the adults. Logan turned pale. His breath caught in a gasp, and he looked at his mother for help. But Patricia took a step back, because even she understood that what was coming was stronger than any excuse. Jessica opened her purse and took out a folded envelope. She placed it on the dining table, where crumbs of stale bread still remained, and slid it toward Logan, saying that there was the certificate, proving that he was the father of Caleb, that he had known for years, and had always said he would fix things later, but later never came, and the boy had already grown up with questions that needed answers. The silence in the room was absolute. Clara looked at the little boy with tenderness and remembered Scarlett as a child. In her eyes shone a mixture of compassion and sadness, because she understood that this child was innocent of everything and didn't deserve to carry the shame of the adults. Scarlett, hearing Jessica's words and seeing the certificate with her husband's name written in official ink, collapsed into her chair as if the floor had given way beneath her feet. Her body slumped, her hands fell into her lap, and for the first time in days, she found no strength to hold on to the pride that had dominated her for so long. Her tears were not of rage, but of defeat. And there it is, the final blow that shatters the illusion. The very warning her mother tried to give her, has come true in the most devastating way possible. Now, stripped of her pride, her home, and the perfect future she imagined, Scarlett is left with nothing but the truth. The question is, what will she do with it? And although no one accused her with words, she felt judged by life itself, as if everything she had built around her wedding had crumbled in a single blow. Logan tried to stammer an explanation, saying it was before he got serious with Scarlett, that he planned to resolve it when the time was right, that he didn't want to cause harm, but his voice faded as he spoke, because each phrase sounded weaker and more useless, and the boy looked at him in silence, as if expecting something more than excuses from him. Walter rested his cane on the floor and didn't need to raise his voice for everyone to hear when he said that the truth always comes out, even if you try to hide it under layers of silence, and that what Logan needed to learn was that manhood isn't measured in parties or promises, but in the ability to take responsibility for what you create. Clara gently stroked the boy's head and smiled at him, saying he was not to blame for anything, that there would always be a place for him in her home. And that tenderness contrasted with the rigidity of Scarlett, who remained slumped in her chair, unable to look at anyone. The echo of that scene spread throughout the entire ranch. The neighbors soon learned that the wedding had ended not only with humiliation, but also with a revealed secret. And as the sun set that evening over the wet fields, Scarlett silently understood that her pride had protected nothing, that her arrogance had left her empty, and that the little boy with a top in his hands had been the second blow that finally shattered her world. The Salgado house had fallen into an unsettling silence after the storm of the wedding and the scandal with Jessica and the boy. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was one of those that weighs on your shoulders and makes you feel that even the walls are breathing a sick air. The courtyard floor was still damp, and the cold tiles seemed to absorb the mud from those days. And from inside the main room, a harsh sound could be heard that broke the heart. It was Clara's cough, a deep cough that came from the very bottom of her lungs and grew more intense each night. The fall in the mud and the soaked clothes in the middle of the storm had taken their toll. And although she tried to resist with her usual strength, her 9-year-old body no longer had the same defenses. First, it was a mild cold, then a fever that rose and fell like waves, and on the third day, the doctors said with a serious face that it was pneumonia, that she needed absolute bed rest and to stay warm. The woman who had always been the family's pillar, the one who sewed, cooked, and patiently mended life's cracks, now lay in bed with sweaty skin, her hair stuck to her forehead, and short of breath, as if each inhale was a battle she fought alone in the dimness of the room. Scarlett, who until then had walked around wrapped in pride, began to break inside as she saw her mother weakened. Although at first she just watched her from the doorway, one afternoon she entered with slow steps and approached the bed, carrying a bowl of water and some clean cloths. Clumsily, but with sincerity, she soaked the cloths and placed them on her mother's burning forehead. And as she did so, she murmured that she had never imagined seeing her so frail, that she always thought her mother was invincible. In her voice, guilt and the need to repair the irreparable were mixed. Clara barely opened her tired, moist eyes and tried to smile, but the fever wouldn't let her form a word. Scarlett, with tears running down her face, hurried to prepare a chamomile tea like the ones her mother used to give her as a child, stirring the leaves in the hot water with hands that trembled more from emotion than from fear. And upon returning with the cup, she leaned over her mother and whispered between sobs to forgive her, that she didn't know how she could have pushed her that day, that arrogance had blinded her, and that every night since, she woke up remembering her eyes full of mud. Her voice broke, and she said that if she could go back, she would have stayed quiet, that she should have never raised her hand or her voice to her, that she had always felt her mother was clipping her wings, but now she understood that all she was doing was protecting her. The tears overwhelmed her as she held the cup, and they fell into the tea, mixing with the steam as if they were part of the remedy. Clara, in a barely perceptible thread of a voice, managed to say that every mother carries guilt, that perhaps she had been too harsh or had stayed silent too often, but that deep down, she had always loved with the strength of someone who gives everything without expecting thanks. And although she couldn't speak more, the weak squeeze of her hand was enough for Scarlett to understand that forgiveness was there, that reconciliation didn't need speeches or witnesses, only the truth of a daughter kneeling by the bedside. Outside, Walter peeked into the room from the hallway and watched in silence, leaning on his cane. And for the first time in a long time, he let a tear escape, because he understood that this moment of fragility was also an act of teaching, that his daughter's illness was weaving an invisible bridge between mother and granddaughter, a bridge that neither arrogance nor shame had been able to build. Logan, secluded in the living room, heard the sobs and shivered, because he sensed that truth and responsibility were chains that would sooner or later catch up with him too. And in the dimness of that sick house, everyone carried their own lesson. Scarlett continued to watch over her mother night after night, changing warm cloths, blowing on the tea so it wouldn't burn, arranging the blankets so the cold wouldn't defeat her, and every gesture was a stitch that sewed the broken relationship back together. Every tear was a silent confession of what she hadn't known how to say in time. The fever remained high, but through Clara's deliriums, words were heard that she repeated with obstinacy. Respect is not shouted, respect is lived. And those phrases were engraved in Scarlett's memory, like a prayer that resonated stronger than any sermon. It's often in our weakest moments that we find our greatest strength, the strength to forgive and to ask for forgiveness. The bond between Scarlett and her mother is beginning to mend, but the wounds of public shame run deep. True redemption requires more than a private apology. Stay with us to see if Scarlett has the courage to face the community she scorned. The illness became the intimate stage where resentment disappeared, and love, wounded and stained with mud, found a way to be reborn amidst sighs and shared silences. The dawn advanced slowly inside the house, and the wind outside made the tree branches creak, as if they too were bending under the weight of everything that had happened in those days. The room where Clara lay was filled with a thick air, a mixture of the smell of chamomile tea, the cold sweat of fever, and the wax of a lit candle that barely illuminated the gloom. Scarlett sat by the bed, her hair messy and her eyes swollen from crying. Her hands remained busy, wringing out damp cloths and placing them carefully on her mother's burning forehead. In every gesture, there was a desperate tenderness, as if she were trying to sew with her fingers the invisible wounds she had opened with her pride. Clara, weakened, could barely open her eyes, but in a moment of respiratory calm, when the coughing subsided and her body stopped shaking, she looked up at her daughter. With a voice full of tremor but also serenity, she said that she forgave her, now, that she needed no more tears or justifications, because forgiveness was a gift given without conditions. Scarlett let out a deep sob and pressed her forehead to her mother's hand, feeling that those words were the most powerful medicine, more than any tea or ointment. Her lips stammered that she didn't deserve this forgiveness, that she had been cruel, blind, and arrogant, that she pushed her into the mud in front of everyone because she had let pride dictate her heart, and now she didn't know how to repair such great damage. Clara, her eyes moist but serene, added slowly that she also forgave herself for not having taught her in time what true respect was, because perhaps she had remained silent when she should have spoken, or had allowed pride to grow between them like an uncut weed. And in that confession, not only a mother's love was revealed, but the humility of one who acknowledges her own mistakes, even on the verge of illness. The atmosphere in the room changed. It was as if with those phrases, the air became lighter, and the burden of resentment dissolved into invisible particles. Scarlett felt her heart burn with a mixture of pain and relief, understanding that her mother's lesson was not in reproaches, but in the ability to transform suffering into teaching. At that moment, Walter entered the room with slow steps, leaning on his cane, and approached the bed without a word. He bent down with difficulty and took his daughter's shawl in his hands, stroking the fabric as if also stroking all the memories of her life, from the days when Clara was a little girl running barefoot to the present, where she fought against the fever. Walter closed his eyes for a moment and murmured that a family's strength is not in houses or deeds, but in the way they care for one another, and that this shawl, worn by the years, was a witness to the dignity that must never be lost. Scarlett heard him and felt that those words were also for her, like a warning and a hope. She understood that she had to start living differently, without shouting or pride, but with patience and respect. The silence in the room became sacred, as if even the storm outside had stopped to let this moment of reconciliation fill every corner. And respect began to return to the house, not as a command imposed, but as a fresh air circulating through the walls. A respect born of pain and forgiveness. A respect that was felt in the way Scarlett arranged her mother's blankets, in the way Walter stood holding the shawl, and in Clara's deep sigh as she breathed calmly for the first time in days. That night, there were no speeches or celebrations, no music or raised glasses. But what there was a simple and powerful truth. That a family can break into 1,000 pieces and still rebuild itself if it learns to ask for forgiveness and to forgive. If it learns that respect is not shouted, but lived. And in that humble room, lit only by the flickering light of a candle, everyone understood that the wound could begin to close, because the lesson had been planted in the hearts of those who were willing to listen. The afternoon sun fell on the town with a dry heat that kicked up dust in every corner of the town square. And while the children ran after a makeshift ball and the women returned from the farmer's market with baskets of vegetables, the figure of Scarlett appeared on the dirt road leading to the community hall, the same hall that just days before had been the scene of her wedding, the interrupted music, the push of her mother, and her grandfather's sentence. She walked with her head down, her hair hastily tied back, and a straw broom in her hand. Her steps echoed in her own memory like the tolling of a bell, forcing her to confront what she had left behind. She wore no party dress or makeup, just a simple blouse and worn pants. And in that attire was the clearest sign that she came not as a haughty bride, but as a repentant daughter, as a woman who had decided to fix what was broken. When she reached the entrance of the hall, she found it empty. The tables were still in disarray, the chairs piled against the walls, and the floor covered in dried mud and withered petals, as if the shame had decided to stick to every corner. Scarlett took a deep breath, gripped the broom with both hands, and began to sweep from the back, raising small clouds of dust that mixed with the stale smell of spilled wine. With every movement, she felt that she was not just cleaning a hall, but also a wound, that every sweep was an attempt to erase the footprints of her pride. Hours passed. Sweat ran down her forehead, and her arms ached, but she did not stop. She bent down to pick up wet papers, dragged the heavy benches back to their places, scrubbed the stains from the floor with an old rag. She did it all alone, without company or music, only with the echo of her thoughts, reminding her that she was the one who had caused this disaster. Some neighbors began to peek through the open windows, first curious, then surprised to see Clara's daughter cleaning with her bare hands what, days before, had been a source of shame for everyone. And little by little, they approached the door, watching in silence as the woman who had humiliated her mother now bowed before the community's floor. When she could no longer ignore their stares, Scarlett set the broom aside, wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, and stood in the middle of the hall, raising her voice just enough for everyone to hear. She said she had no excuses, that she had allowed arrogance to turn her into someone she didn't recognize, that she had let anger dictate her actions, and that she had hurt not only her mother, but also the dignity of the entire town that had witnessed that scene. Her words came out choked but firm. She continued, saying she wasn't there to justify herself because excuses don't erase humiliation. All she brought were her hands to serve. The little she could offer now was work, humility, and a willingness to rebuild what she had broken, and she hoped that one day her community could forgive her. The silence was profound after those words, so profound that you could hear the buzz of a fly trapped in an empty glass. And in that silence, you could sense the internal struggle of each neighbor. Some wanted to condemn her forever, others were moved by the sincerity in her eyes, and others simply remembered that everyone, at some point, had had to learn the lesson of respect. It was then that an elderly woman from the town stepped forward and said that forgiveness is not begged for with speeches, but earned with actions, and that if Scarlett was willing to prove it with consistency and not just words, then she was willing to give her a chance. That voice was followed by a general murmur. Some nodded, others crossed their arms, but everyone understood that something had changed. Earning back trust is a journey that begins with a single, humble step, and Scarlett has just taken it. The community has opened the door for her, just a crack, but it's enough. Now, we return to the ranch to see how this newfound humility will truly heal the heart of her family in our story's conclusion. The woman who days before had been a symbol of broken pride now stood as an example of nascent humility. Scarlett bowed her head and gave thanks with silent tears. She picked up the broom again and continued sweeping without stopping, while the neighbors began to come in, little by little, some to help, others just to watch, but all with the certainty that they were witnessing the beginning of a repair greater than the hall itself. A repair that had to be stitched like the hems her mother always said are fixed with patience, without hiding the stitch. The afternoon was slowly settling over the ranch, and the air carried a smell of damp earth left over from the past rains. The house was calm after so many tense days, and it seemed that the walls could finally breathe a little peace. In the main room, illuminated by the golden light coming through the window, Clara sat in a low chair with her sewing in her hands, a piece of fabric she had saved to teach her daughter what she had always called an art of patience. Next to her was Scarlett, bent over the same cloth, clumsily following the movement of the needle, trying to learn what she had once despised. And that scene, mother and daughter sewing together, was the clearest image that what had been broken was beginning to mend without rush, but without pause. Scarlett said, her voice filled with emotion, that she had never stopped to watch the calm with which her mother sewed, that she always thought it was a simple, boring task, but now she understood that every stitch held a hidden lesson. Clara smiled sweetly, replying that just as a torn edge is fixed with a needle and patience, so too can the heart be mended when one stops chasing after pride. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, Caleb ran after his wooden top as it spun on the worn tiles. His childish laughter mixed with the bird's song, a sound that brought new life to a house that had known more tears than joy in recent weeks. The boy, oblivious to the weight of the adults, picked up the top every time it fell and launched it again with inexhaustible enthusiasm. And with every spin, he seemed to remind everyone that innocence is capable of renewing what the elders believe is lost. From the living room, Walter rested in his rocking chair, his cane leaning beside him, his eyes closed as if he could finally surrender to sleep after having defended his daughter's dignity so rigorously. And though his lips barely moved, he seemed to form a slight smile, a silent satisfaction in knowing that his lesson had sunk deep and that his family was beginning to find its way again. Clara, watching Scarlett as she guided her sewing, said slowly, "This is how you fix a torn edge, with patience and without hiding the stitch." And that phrase hung in the air like a truth that needed no explanation, like a legacy passed from one generation to the next, in a gesture as simple as sewing together. Scarlett paused for a moment, looked up with shining eyes, and said that perhaps the most difficult tear was not in the fabric, but inside her, that she still felt the weight of the shame and the pain she had caused. Clara caressed her hand, replying, "That's why you start from the inside, because the most important seams are not seen, but they hold everything else together." Outside, Caleb shouted with joy because the top had spun longer than ever, and that small childish triumph was received by Clara as a sign that life always turns, that what seems to fall can rise again, that even falls in the mud can be transformed into steps toward dignity. Walter, in his sleep, barely moved the rocking chair and murmured that now he could rest, that what he had sown was bearing fruit. His deep breathing filled the house with a serene hum, as if peace had finally found a place to stay. The day died in silence, and the golden light faded. But inside the house, the certainty remained lit that respect had returned, not as a command imposed by the force of a cane, but as a lesson born from pain, forgiveness, and the will to start over. Scarlett continued sewing under her mother's guidance. Caleb kept playing in the courtyard, and Walter slept peacefully. And in that simple but truthful picture, it was understood that there was no need for a finale with fireworks, because what is truly human is learning to live with the scars in plain sight, always remembering that every visible stitch is proof that what is broken can be mended when the heart decides to no longer hide the wound. Finally, Scarlett learned a hard-won lesson. Pride could build a glamorous wedding, but only respect could keep a home. Her bitter experience is a reminder to us all that true value lies not in status or material things, but in how we treat our roots. For Clara, the greatest victory was not getting the house back, but finding the daughter who had seemed lost to pride. The fall in the mud that day was painful, but the fever that followed became a cleansing fire, burning away all resentment and leaving her with peace. She realized a mother's love is not a ledger of debts, but a resilient thread, patiently sewing together the deepest tears in a child's soul. The lesson she gave her daughter was not found in scolding words, but in quiet forgiveness and the way she guided the needle through the cloth. Because a true family is built from the moments one is willing to bend down to mend. If this mother's forgiveness and this lesson on mending have warmed your heart, please subscribe to the channel to join us in spreading more profound and humane stories.